This is where today we finally have a new strategy. Here's the new program from the United States. Today, Trump announced, how are we going to end this war on our terms? He says there's going to be an economic D-Day. So 2 weeks ago, Trump said there was going to be a literal D-Day, like a literal air campaign. We're going to bomb them with real bombs like we did to Germany in World War II. Now Trump says it's going to be an economic D-Day, so we're not going to bomb them. Trump says we're going to ratchet up the economic pressure so intensely that it resembles the D-Day invasion, which is kind of a ridiculous premise. The whole point of D-Day is that it was, by tonnage and personnel, the biggest amphibious assault of all time. It's not really quite the same thing when you say we're going to add a few more sanctions. That resembles the D-Day invasion. We've already put every type of sanction available to us on Iran's economy. Financial sanctions, banking sanctions against their personnel, against their oil industry, against everything. We've imposed a blockade on the Persian Gulf, on all their ports. So we're going to add a few marginal sanctions on top, and that resembles the largest amphibious assault in history. It just doesn't even make any sense. And so this is a story from the New York Times. It says, quote, President Trump issued his latest threat in the war with Iran, vowing on Wednesday to impose tremendous economic consequences on countries that do business with Iran. Mr. Trump did not specify in a social media post what actions he would take. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent warned last week of never-before-seen measures to pressure Iran. Really? Somehow I have a feeling that everything they're going to do is something we've seen before. Never before seen. I wouldn't even call that a hyperbole. I'd more just say that's a straight-up lie. They're going to do a series of things, if anything, that we are totally familiar with, which we've seen already. I would venture to guess they're not going to do a single thing that any of us have not seen before. Anyway, it goes on. It says, without identifying particular countries, Mr. Trump seemed to suggest that he could target nations that buy Iranian oil. He referred to tactics that Iran has used to circumvent the U.S. sanctions that it weathered for years before the war began. The Treasury Department could impose secondary sanctions on buyers of Iranian oil, such as China, but that would ratchet up tensions ahead of President Xi Jinping's visit to the United States, which is scheduled for next month. Many neighboring countries in the Gulf region also have significant economic ties to Iran. The United Arab Emirates announced a total embargo on trade and transactions with Iran on Monday. Trump wrote on Truth Social today, quote, any country that allows its financial institutions, businesses, airports, or government entities to provide any type of lifeline to Iran will itself face tremendous economic consequences. Oil smuggling, swap lines, cash transfers, exchange houses, ship registries, front companies, it all needs to stop now. You know who you are. Mr. Trump asserted, as he has since the opening days of the war, that victory was just over the horizon and that Iran was on the ropes and hanging by a thread. So this is the new plan. We're not bombing Iran because we can't afford to. We bomb Iran and we gain nothing. Conversely, Iran retaliates against us and we have no ability to defend our infrastructure or our allies. So we're bombing Iran's southwestern coast. It is having basically no effect. They retaliate by bombing Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and we're not able to defend these countries.
Guys, this is where I genuinely start asking, what is the objective anymore? Because every new announcement sounds less like a strategy and more like another attempt to find something that works. Trump ran on America first and talked constantly about keeping America out of unnecessary wars. But now we're spending all this attention, money, and political energy on another foreign conflict while Americans are asking what exactly we're getting out of it, and that's what frustrates me. If the military option isn't working, diplomacy isn't moving, and now we're going back to sanctions we've already used before, where does this actually end? At some point, somebody in Washington has to stop worrying about looking tough and start asking whether continuing this is actually making America safer or better off.
So there will be casualties, there will be destruction of civilian infrastructure. So instead, the United States has launched this economic campaign. The U.S. says we're going to blockade the Strait of Hormuz. We're going to attack any shipping that is associated with Iran going to their ports in the Persian Gulf. And now, because Iran is bypassing all of this, they're circumventing the sanctions as well as the blockade with their shadow fleet and falsified ship registries and other things like this. Trump says now we're going to go after the secondary countries like China or others, the United Arab Emirates, that are still doing business with Iran. The problem with this approach, just like with the military approach, is that Iran has already prepared for this. They have spent the past 25 years preparing their economy to be basically self-sufficient. That's the point. Iran is not completely reliant on any one country or all countries. They have a significant relationship with the UAE economically. Some say that the UAE is like the lungs of Iran. This is how Iran is able to do business with the world in spite of the sanctions regime against them. And today, the UAE announced their embargo against Iran. But Iran is not affected by this in a major way. The United States is not going to go after China. We have a significant trading relationship with China, and we tried to impose our own will against them a year ago. It didn't work. So that's out of the question. What reasonably can the United States do to Iran's economy that we have not already done at any time or any period in the past 10 or 15 years that hasn't already been done that is going to change the fundamental equation? The answer is nothing. And I've talked about this before. Fundamentally, it is because Iran is in an existential fight for their lives. They've been under a sanctions regime already. Things have already been bad in Iran. How much worse can it really get? Additionally, as bad as things are in Iran, and things are bad, they're estimating that Iran's economy has suffered losses in the hundreds of billions of dollars as a result of the U.S. blockade. Some say it's between $100 and $350 billion. It's a pretty widespread. But they say the damage is significant. But the reason Iran is able to weather the storm is because the war is on their doorstep. We have a much lower tolerance for economic pain because for us, this is a war of choice. Even though our economy is not as badly affected, the effects are not as adverse as they are in Iran, our tolerance for the economic pain is so much lower because this is not seen by the American public as a vital interest of the United States, much less existential. So even though compared to what's happening in Iran, $4 and $5 gas prices are an inconvenience, a mild one at best, and inflation has ticked up 1 or 1.5%, our tolerance for this kind of economic pain is so much lower because Americans don't support the war. The war is happening over there. It's a war of choice, and it's a war of choice that for most Americans, we don't even really understand the rationale for it. And if we do, we don't believe it or we don't support it. Whereas in Iran, even though their economy is being decimated, even though, like I said, the losses are in the hundreds of billions of dollars, they're rationing essential goods and services, they can't get a lot of other things. In spite of the fact the economic pain is much worse, for them, it's a matter of survival. The war is happening in their country. They are defending their country against an outside attack, trying to overthrow their government, destabilize their country, and ultimately take away their sovereignty. So even though the pain is worse, they're willing and able to bear and endure it because for them, this is a matter of survival, it's a matter of independence and autonomy, and fundamentally, it's about their sovereignty. So maybe on a long enough timeline, Iran would not be able to sustain the economic pain. Maybe it cannot go on indefinitely and permanently, but it can go on longer for Iran than it can for us. And that's the fundamental problem. Could Iran sustain the barrage of military attacks and economic pressure forever? Probably not. If we were bombing them 30,000 times a month forever, if we blockaded their ports in the Persian Gulf and had the sanctions regime against Iran forever, eventually Iranian society would collapse. But that's not the question. It's not whether Iran can survive, period. It's whether they can survive longer than we can. It would collapse. But that's not the question. It's not whether Iran can survive, period. It's whether they can survive longer than we can.
And that's the biggest difference nobody should ignore. Iran sees this as a fight happening right outside its own front door. That gives them a completely different tolerance for pain than the United States has. We can destroy equipment, increase sanctions, and keep applying pressure, but Iran doesn't need to completely defeat America militarily. It just needs to make the cost of continuing higher than Americans are willing to tolerate, and the Strait of Hormuz gives them enormous leverage. Even a small disruption there can create problems far beyond Iran itself. So why keep playing a game where the other side is clearly prepared to suffer longer than we are?
Can they survive the military barrage longer than the Persian Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the UAE? It's not a question of can they sustain the economic pressure forever. It's whether they can sustain it longer than the American public during a midterm election year and when the strategic oil reserve runs out. That's the question. So what we basically have learned at this point in time is that there really is no plan here, still to this day. 6 months into the war, and what you see is this administration is just throwing things at the wall to see what's going to stick. We had a plan at the very beginning, like we've talked about, which was to go in as hard as possible, overwhelming force. It was going to be, or supposed to be, a decisive confrontation that would decapitate the government. The regime would be replaced by the masses in some kind of popular uprising after the initial assault. And when that did not happen, and Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, at that point, we were out of ideas with no plan and basically no backup options. And so we tried to just keep the pressure up. Okay, well, it didn't work in the first 4 days. Let's keep it going for 6 weeks and see how that goes. That didn't work. So then we shifted to diplomacy and we tried to negotiate with Iran. And that culminated in the MOU. And then that didn't work. So then we tried bombing them again. We said, let's try this again. Maybe if we hit them for a couple more weeks, and maybe if we threaten to expand the target bank and go after civilian infrastructure, maybe if we threaten to intensify the bombing, maybe that'll work. Turns out we already ran out of ammunition, so we tried diplomacy again. And now this is something like the 5th turn. This is like the 5th phase. The initial assault was a failure. The initial diplomacy was a failure. The return to arms was a failure. They weren't interested in going back to the table. So now we're going to try this hybrid approach where we're not bombing them, but we're also not pursuing diplomacy. Now we're at war with them economically with a blockade. Only problem is we've already been doing this for 10 years. Trump effectively imposed something like this blockade back in 2018 when we left the JCPOA. Iran has been under a maximum pressure sanctions regime ever since for 8 years. And they never came close to buckling at any time in those 8 years, even when they had massive protests back in January. All Iran did was turn off the internet and kill thousands of people, and that was it. We think we're going to shut down their economy now. They've already been made self-sufficient because of the sanctions regime. They learned how to survive under the sanctions regime, and to the extent that they could not survive, they learned how to circumvent the sanctions regime. They're circumventing the blockade of the Strait by putting their shipping in the Caspian Sea, which connects to Russia. They're circumventing the blockade with their shadow fleet of tankers. They're circumventing the sanctions regime by interacting with other revisionist powers like China and Russia. And so this is what we've been talking about from the beginning. Iran has been preparing for this war militarily, economically, for the past 2 decades. They put all of their weapons production underground. They turned their country into a weapons-making factory. Drones, missiles, centrifuges. They've got a 1 million-man army loyal to the regime that we're trying to replace. They're totally insulated from outside attempts to penetrate their society. Their regime has made the economy sanctions-proof because they've had to out of necessity. And so now what we found is that Iran is something like a porcupine. We can't swallow them. We can't step on them. There's nothing that we can do to them. And so it's like I said throughout the war, all that is left for the United States to do is really make the decision. Are we going to, and are we prepared to, escalate to victory? Because that involves not an economic blockade or these minor strikes like Israel described it, a contained bombing campaign on the coast. Are we prepared to invade the islands and then siege the mainland from the islands? Are we prepared to do this? If not, and I don't think anybody in Washington thinks that's a good idea, if not, then all this is a question of how much longer are we willing to endure the pain before we accept the inevitable, which is that this is a total strategic defeat. This is a pivotal error that the United States has made in the history of our foreign policy. In our 250-year history, this is a pivotal mistake. And we fully capitulate to all of Iran's demands. And I think that we are headed there. Our other story for tonight about Iran gives us some insight into this fact, and it concerns America's footprint in the region. So in the course of the war, we've bombed Iran thousands of times. And the thing about Iran is that they've already gone to work repairing everything that we've destroyed. Israel and the United States estimate that Iran will have fully repaired their missile production capacity, their military industrial capacity, their drone and missile stockpile within 6 months at the latest. They say that by mid-2027, Iran is going to be right back to the level they were at from before the war in terms of their ability to make weapons and the stockpile of weapons. So it is as if nothing had happened. They have erased all of the damage that we've done. They're reset, ready to go midway through 2027. On the other side, the United States has been decimated. Our bases have been destroyed in Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Emirates. We actually abandoned all of our bases before the war started because we knew we couldn't defend them. Those bases are not hardened against Iranian attacks. We have no ability to deflect any kind of missile strikes against them, so we left them, and Iran destroyed a lot of them. And now the new story from the Washington Post is that the United States is considering not even rebuilding the bases because to rebuild them would be pointless.
This part is almost unbelievable. We're now discussing whether rebuilding these bases is even worth it because they could simply become targets again. But that's exactly the kind of consequence you should think about before entering a war. You can't launch attacks against another country and then act shocked when that country targets your military infrastructure in return. And if the Pentagon really decides some of these positions are too vulnerable to rebuild, then the consequences of this conflict aren't temporary anymore. They're changing America's entire military position in the region. So at what point do we admit that continuing simply because nobody wants to admit failure could create even more damage?
All the bases that are in range of Iran's missiles and drones will surely be destroyed again in the event of another war. And they actually represent something like a liability. We have our 40,000 U.S. personnel that are deployed in the region, for the most part, near or in the Persian Gulf, and all they are is sitting ducks. All they are is effectively a hostage that in the event we initiate hostilities against Iran, those are going to be the casualties in the opening stage of the war. So now the Pentagon says, we're not even going to rebuild the bases. Instead, we're going to reposition all of our forces further west, further away from Iran, out of the Persian Gulf, in places like Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, which is in the center of the Arabian Peninsula, west into Jordan, or even into Israel. And we might put some of our Air Force and personnel permanently in Israel. This is a story from the Post. It says, quote, "The Pentagon is evaluating its military footprint in the Middle East in an early sign of the Iran war's potential to transform the U.S. presence in the region. One of the key areas the Defense Department is assessing is whether to pull back troops from the Persian Gulf, where America's large overseas military bases have been battered by months of Iranian strikes. The damage to these facilities has prompted a once-in-a-generation chance for the Pentagon to reconsider its presence in the region. The Defense Department has already signaled that it might not rebuild its bases as they were before the conflict. U.S. Central Command, which runs U.S. military operations in the Middle East, normally stations about 40,000 troops across almost 20 sites and a 1,500-mile arc from Jordan to Oman. America's largest and most permanent bases in the Middle East are in the Persian Gulf, where Bahrain hosts the headquarters of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, and where other states such as Kuwait house Army and Air Force assets. Allies in the Gulf have for decades depended on U.S. forces for their defense. Any regional drawdown could leave states unable to defend themselves against Iranian attacks. Investing in domestic capabilities or partnering with other powers to offset the shortfall could take months to years. A recent policy proposal from Defense Priorities, a think tank advocating for military restraint, calls for closing U.S. bases in close striking range of Iran's missiles and drones, such as Kuwait. The proposal also calls for moving forces dispersed in the UAE, Jordan, and Bahrain to more secure facilities, such as the Prince Sultan Air Base near Riyadh. Now, if you've been paying attention to our coverage of the Iran war so far, this coincidentally happens to be one of Iran's demands. So for Iran to open the strait and for them to leave us alone, they're saying they want to control the strait. They're saying they want their reparations and restitution. They want the sanctions lifted. And among other things, they're saying they want U.S. military bases out of the Persian Gulf. They want us to take all of our personnel and all the bases out of the Gulf and away from Iran's borders further west, elsewhere in the Middle East. So if this Washington Post report is correct, then what they're really talking about is capitulating. What they're effectively saying is, we're going to surrender to Iran. Think about how things are evolving. We're not bombing Iran, even though the strait is closed. We're not negotiating with Iran. We're not talking about restarting the war. So effectively, Iran controls the strait. Iran is working out an agreement with Oman, and they've totally cut the U.S. out of the process. We're kind of letting them have the strait right now. In addition, we're talking about moving our bases away. If Iran controls the strait, that means they're not going to let U.S. naval assets in and out of the Persian Gulf. So we're effectively saying, you can keep the strait. You can control which military ships get through the strait. We're going to take our bases out of the Persian Gulf and away from your borders, effectively giving Iran something like a sphere of influence over the Persian Gulf. Everything that is within striking distance of Iran's drones, missiles, even artillery, is going to be abandoned to Iran. That includes the strait, that includes the Gulf, that includes our bases near and around the Gulf and Iran's borders. And by the way, what do you think happens when Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz? Not only do they claim it and it's theirs, not only do they use their control over it to deny a U.S. naval presence inside the Gulf, but also, as we all know and have talked about, they're going to charge service fees. They're going to charge a toll. And the money they collect from the Persian Gulf, they're going to use to fund their reconstruction.
And when you put everything together, this is why the situation looks so bad. The United States entered this conflict expecting pressure to force Iran into giving something up. Instead, according to what we've just heard, Iran is still operating, America is reconsidering its military presence in the Gulf, and the Strait of Hormuz has become an even bigger source of leverage. Whatever you think about Trump, that deserves serious scrutiny. He campaigned on ending wars and putting America first. So Americans have every right to ask, how has this conflict improved our position? If we're spending enormous amounts of money, risking American lives, damaging bases, disrupting energy markets, and then potentially moving our forces farther away anyway, what exactly was accomplished? And this isn't about cheering for Iran. I want the United States to succeed. That's exactly why I don't want our government getting trapped in conflicts where there isn't a clear objective or realistic exit strategy. The most dangerous thing Washington can do now is continue escalating simply because admitting the original strategy failed would be politically embarrassing. Sometimes protecting the country means knowing when a strategy isn't working and changing course before the cost becomes even higher. But I want to know what you guys think. Do you think the United States should keep applying pressure and try to force a different outcome? Or has this reached the point where Washington should negotiate an exit and end the conflict? Drop your opinion in the comments because I genuinely want to see where people stand on this. And if you enjoy these reaction videos, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.